Before I start, I just want to acknowledge Chen as a leader and as an example for, I think, a lot of Asian American executives who are trying to figure out what the hell to do in this world. He's been a leader, not just as an example of someone who's been able to run multiple companies, but also as a philanthropist. And I have to say that because my uncle is the John and Sherry Chen Endowed Chair in Clinical Neurosurgery at UCSF. So thank you for your example. So I've got about 15 minutes to talk a little bit about the future of data. And the future of data is not enough. We live in a world that is full of sort of failed experiments, IT projects that people sort of hope will work, don't quite work, and then later explain away with like nice PowerPoint slides. And I think a lot of that is driven in part because we still live in a world of Jim Barksdale. So this is Jim Barksdale. I don't know who remembers him. He was CEO of Netscape, an incredibly great leader, and he had like this thing that he'd say over and over again, which is, if we have data, let's look at the data, and if we all have opinions, let's go with mine. And this basic frame is the way that I think most companies think about data right now. And that leads to sort of rhetoric like this, which is that we need to be data-driven. We need data liquidity. What does data liquidity mean? Data liquidity means that someone has some data in some silo that you can't quite find yet, but if you could find it, suddenly everything would be better. And that leads to data availability, which has a whole bunch of issues around privacy and whether you should see this data or not. And then in theory, that leads to these sort of wonderful data-based decisions. And let me suggest to you that although that rhetoric is really important for a lot of the companies I invest in, and I'm very grateful for sort of large projects that are being done, that data-based decisions aren't enough, that actually they are fundamentally misguided. And that's in part because of this guy. This is Danny Kahneman. Danny Kahneman, about 16 years ago, won the Nobel Prize in economics, even though he was actually an experimental psychologist who ran sort of slightly cruel experiments, mostly initially on Israeli military officers. He would do things like he would see whether you felt worse if you were 1 minute late or 2 hours late. He would do things like he would say, if you were a judge and you made a decision at 9 a.m. versus a decision at 2 p.m., would you be nicer to people? And so what he found, for better or worse, is that we are all systematically wrong or biased in lots and lots of ways over and over again. And so about a year ago, Danny was at a conference I was at with a bunch of economists talking about artificial intelligence. And then he said, as he would, because he's sort of like fairly neurotic, he said, I think my life is fundamentally wrong. I spent all my time worried about people making systematic mistakes. That's not the actual issue. The actual issue is that we are noisy thinkers, that we're narrow thinkers, and it's very easy to do better than we would. Meaning that, like, for better or worse, if you think about how you honestly make some of your most important decisions, we are fairly random. And so he would do this also, I would think, fairly cruel thing that he did with a couple of fairly large companies, where he would do what he would call a noise audit. And here's what he'd do. So he, because he won a Nobel Prize, all the CEOs want to talk to him, right? And so he's very impressive and very entertaining. And he'd say, you know what? Let's go and find 2 of your best teams. And let's do some critical activity to your business. And the one he talked about all the time, it's around insurance underwriting. So let's find some case, here's like all the slides, and let's look at the case, and let's give it to 2 separate teams, and then let's see what kind of price they come up with for underwriting it.
I don't know.
And then, sort of the CEO would find the 2 best teams. They say, well, there'll be some variation naturally. It'll be like, and the guess is like, what kind of variation? And typically it'd be, I don't know, the guess would be, what would you folks guess? Like plus or minus 10, 15%, or something like that, right? And what he would find is that the variation was 50%, meaning that with the 2 best teams in a company doing a task that was core to their business, what they found was enormous variation. And worse than that, senior executives didn't realize there was a lot of that variation. And I would suggest to you that even as we live in a world awash with data right now, we still live in a time when most of the critical business decisions that are made in most companies are still fairly noisy and random. And so that's why I think that you'll see in a lot of the most interesting businesses today that they have moved from a data-based mindset to say we will make data-based or data-driven decisions to a model-driven mindset. And like models sound so impressive and they sound so scary. They're not. And I'll talk a little about that in a moment. But they will also move their focus from worrying about automation of workflows to automation of key decisions. And so what does that mean? You know, sort of like, they're not always fancy. You know, sort of there are, since the 60s, there have been like relatively good scorecards for doctors around making medical decisions to figure out whether you have something like pneumonia. And if you look at those, they're really dumb checklists. They'll be like, I will give you 1 point if you're coughing. I'll give you 2 points if like you look funny, right? And then they'll add it all up, and then they'll say, do you have pneumonia or not? And it seems ridiculous, but I'll talk in a moment about why it's better. You know, so that's like the simplest example of a model to, you know, sort of models that are slightly fancier where you might hire McKinsey to do like a statistical regression that you did when you were like a sophomore in college, right? You collect all this data, you do like a fancy statistical regression, and come up with some very nice formula that you apply to decisions you make. Or it could be as complicated as sort of the stuff I mostly invest in, which are neural networks, right? And so like, but all of those things are just models, and they're models in the sense that I will give you some consistent, routinized set of inputs, and out will come some decision or prediction about what you should do, right? And I would suggest that that frame of thinking, although not perfect and terrible in many ways, is actually what we should be focused on right now. And that for better or worse, most of the fears around AI are entirely misplaced. That most of the fears right now around AI are anticipatory rather than dealing with things that are around the world as it actually is. That actually what we should be doing instead is focus on building models that we will depend on and then figuring out what to do about them and how to actually implement them in the real world. And so what are the advantages of models? Models are consistent. They don't have tummy aches. They don't have like, I don't know, my kids were annoying today and I will make some slightly different decision result. Models are not like that. Models are also faster. I hem and haw all the time around major decisions I have to make, oftentimes even though I have all the data. I know that's not true about any of you out there, but it might be true about your employees, right? And I think that like models are also critically closed loop. That because a model will consistently come up with some outcome, you can actually see what decision was made, and then you can actually see whether it worked or not. And although they are imperfect, because of course all models are imperfect, but the truth is I'm imperfect as well, they're also improvable. And they're improvable because you can actually update the model. You can decide that we want to add new data sources. You can decide you want to have different weights. If you do all of that, you might actually have an organization that improves. And so what do we need in order to come up with this sort of like model-centric world? Now, you can have things as fancy, like you can have things as like boring as Google Sheets. I would suggest to you that some of the biggest process improvements and some of the best private equity firms in the world right now have been forcing partners to score multiple like investments on multiple dimensions, putting in a spreadsheet, and then seeing what ends up working or not, right? And so it can be that simple, or it could be as complicated or as nuanced as something like Graphistry, which is a tool on the right that will pull together large data sets, look for interesting relationships between those data, pieces of data, and then help decision makers visualize, automate, and sort of model it. And so I would just suggest that like those things are all out there right now. So you have like that wide spectrum, and you can get started like right now, like literally right now, that you can decide that there are key decisions that we are actually making right now that we should routinize just a little bit more. Now, that creates all sorts of other problems. I should do the review on that a little better. So, you know, like, it turns out that people will often have questions about fairness, around issues around, I don't know, just imagine all the issues you read about in the paper. And I'd suggest to you that we've been dealing with those problems for many years because we've all worked inside regulatory environments or bureaucracies or processes, and there's a whole school of thought around figuring out how to deal with it. And so there's this notion of that I love of street-level bureaucrats, which is Michael Lipsky came up with this in like the 60s. And his point is, although you have a justice system, the actual implementation and the actual papering over of the ways that the justice system is bad or not complete is done by police officers. That there are people actually on the ground who will be able to override the system and say, you know what, actually, this is not quite right, and we need to think about this a little bit differently. And in the same way, in the best companies, they will also implement similar safeguards or ways to get around the models. But that only happens if you take the model seriously. If the model is a plaything you do on the side for some innovation project that's not core to your business, then no one's really going to care, and no one's going to actually develop the business processes and organizations you need to come up with solutions. You read these articles about Google and Facebook having all these problems with hate speech. I would suggest that the good news there is they're actually having those problems, and they're actually coming up with solutions for it. And in many ways, most of the best companies who are relying on models are running up against those limitations right now, and they're solving them, and they're figuring out how to deal with them. And I suggest that, like, a lot of the companies that poo-poo those ideas and say, well, wait a little bit longer, they will have to deal with those issues, but they'll deal with it in an environment in which, like, all their competitors have figured out how to deal with models as first-class citizens. And then but wait, it gets worse. So I think that we also live in a world in which the truth is most knowledge work and most key decisions are actually made and understood by people on the ground who are actually doing the work. Not by managers, not by vendors, not by consultants, not by CEOs. And as a result of that, we live in this world in which in the old days, the CEO could have the illusion that they could see the factory floor. In the world we live in, even as I sweep up all of my metadata for calendaring or sweep up all my data for meetings, I still have no good idea around what my key employees are actually doing, and I have no good idea around sort of what clearly should be automated and what are key decisions that should be modeled. And I'd suggest to you that that's a huge opportunity and a huge problem, because right now the incentives for your individual contributors are to hide those opportunities to automate and those opportunities to model. There's like an automator's dilemma, because if you came up with some way in which you only had to work 1 day a week, you would not tell your boss. You would not tell your boss because, you know, sort of in one case, you'd get like, in many cases, your friends get fired. In another case, you get fired, or even worse, you get promoted to middle management. And I think that we live in a world right now where the answers around the automator's dilemma and the folks who figure that out first, and it's not going to be foo-foo nice culture, and it's not going to be better tools, it's going to come from hard economic decisions and different ways to compensate people. And so that's what I'm mostly looking for. And so I hope this has been a helpful peek into sort of what the world might look like over the next few years, or what's happening on the ground in many places. And if you have any thoughts about this, please feel free to reach out. I'm James at BloombergBeta.com. James Cham. Thanks.